Hey everyone, nubkeks here, and in today's video we're discussing the warrior class in Shadowlands and all three of its specs, and asking the very simple question, is it any good? Now, right before we dive into the video, I just want to give a big shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for the support, I really do appreciate it. And by the way, if you're interested in more in-depth dives into the specs, check out my spec deep dive series where I did entire, almost hour-long videos diving into every single detail of the warrior specs in Shadowlands. In fact, every spec in the game. So yeah, check it out. And if you like the series, there are plenty of other videos in the Is It Any Good series as well. I think we've done 4 classes already, something like that. So yeah, check them out too. All right then, well, talking about the warrior, where we're going to start is where we always start these videos, discussing the Covenant abilities, these big 4 signature abilities that you're going to be choosing between as you go into the Shadowlands, at least at the start of the Shadowlands anyway. The first one I want to talk about for the warrior is the Night Fae Covenant ability. This is Ancient Aftershock. Now this actually has already had a rework. So now what this does, it's a 1.5 minute cooldown, instant cast. It does a slam in front of you, kind of the same size and shape as Shockwave, if you're familiar with that from the Fury Warrior or the other warrior specs like way back in the past. But it does a big chunk of nature damage to up to 5 enemies in front of you. It will knock them down, so essentially stun them for 1.5 seconds. And then it leaves this pool on the ground, right? And the ground is going to continue doing a little bit of nature damage to up to 5 enemies in it. Yeah, it lasts for 12 seconds, this little pool. It's quite small, but it generates rage whenever it does damage, and every 3 seconds it will briefly knock targets down as well, essentially interrupting their cast timers or their, whatever they're doing. So pretty nice, right? This one is very good, I think, for AoE. It's certainly not great in single target, but yeah, I mean, the extra bit of crowd control for AoE is great. Keeping mobs inside of it, the area, because it's quite small, is certainly tricky, I think. It's certainly tricky. That might get adjusted, though. Might get a little bit bigger. We'll have to see. But yeah, I don't know. I think the 1.5 minute cooldown actually feels pretty good, and that does sync up pretty well with like the default cooldown of Blade Storm for arms, with Recklessness for Fury, etc. So I think this one is pretty solid if your aim is mostly looking at solo content like Torghast and Mythic Plus Dungeons, where you are going to be fighting stuff in AoE. Falls off a bit in raids. For the Necrolords, we have another reworked ability actually. That's Conqueror's Banner. So this now is a 3-minute cooldown. And you press the button, you can either throw the banner on the ground or you can wear it on your back and it will move around with you, right? So it gives up you and 2 allies within 15 yards of the banner this buff, 20% max health, 10% crit strike chance. Kind of cool, right? Kind of cool. On top of that, for you, there's an extra benefit where for Arms of Protection, for every 20 rage that you spend and every enemy that you kill, you gain a stack of glory. And for Fury, for every 30 rage and enemy kill, you gain a stack of glory. And each stack of glory gives you 1% critical strike damage. That goes up to 30%. That lasts for 30 seconds. This actually carries on for quite a while once the banner dissipates. I have a couple of issues with this right now that hopefully might get tuned up before Shadowlands comes out, so fingers crossed. Number one, I do feel like the 3-minute cooldown is a little bit too long. That's a bit too extreme, I think, right now. The effect I think is pretty fun, but it's just I'm not sure if it's strong enough for the cooldown that's there. And then also, of course, critical strike damage that you're going to get with glory, and seeing as that is based off of spending rage, that's something that's going to be very powerful later on in the expansion, where you've got crit strike chance to back it up, and you've got enough haste and enough extra powers to generate all that rage to actually get lots of stacks of glory. So it's really going to ramp up well, but I think on expansion launch maybe a little bit underwhelming. So I'd say definitely check back on this one. I think it looks a little bit weak right now, to be honest, but I expect that this one could potentially be a lot of fun and pretty cool. And I do like actually the idea of buffing up your teammates as well. If you don't like it, you can pick a different Covenant. The third one I want to talk about is the Venthyr, and this is probably the most hyped up one, which is Condemn. This replaces Execute, and the way it works, it does a little less damage than Execute, but it is shadow damage, which means that it's not reduced by armor. So that's actually a pretty nice perk. On top of that, you can also use it on targets who are above 80% health, as well as the standard Execute effect of below 20% health. And yeah, it also prevents some of the damage the target does to you as well. So definitely the appeal of the... Interestingly enough, right, my first impression of this was going, oh, it's an upgrade to Execute. This is going to be the best for arms. And ironically, no, it's actually best for Fury. Why is that? Because it's very good for Fury in single target. But Fury, with how they work with their Whirlwind, letting their abilities cleave into AoE, Condemn actually becomes an AoE damage dealing ability for them as well. So it's just very good across the board for Fury. For arms and for protection, this is much more of a single target thing. Of course, arms can make it a 2-target thing with sweeping strikes. But yeah, it's certainly, this is the one I've played with the most, and it definitely feels pretty good. What I will say, though, is for how hyped I was for this one, I actually don't feel like now, after it's been nerfed a couple of times, I don't think that this overshadows the other Covenant abilities half as much as I thought that it would. And whereas when I initially saw this, I thought that, hey, I'm going Vent here with my warrior no matter what, and there's no stopping me. Now, to be honest with you, I think I'd be pretty happy to play the other Covenants, and I could live with that and be okay with it. Because, yeah, I think that would be fine with me. So, yeah, that's something to bear in mind. Finally, we have the Kyrian Covenant ability, the Spear of Bastion. This one has also been nerfed quite a bit. This is a 1-minute cooldown. You throw it down on the ground. It's quite a small little area of effect, but it does a nice chunk of arcane damage, and a little bit of that is a 4-second dot. And yeah, it does reduce damage over 5 targets now, which is fair enough, I guess. It's kind of the theme of Shadowlands. The fun thing, though, is that it does generate 25 rage, which is cool, and it will also tether enemies that are hit to the Spear of Bastion for the 4-second duration, which is pretty great, actually. That's pretty cool, that extra crowd control effect. So yeah, I like this one. This obviously competes very much with the Night Fae ability. Both of them are AoE. The Night Fae ability is a little bit more upfront AoE, and then it generates more rage, but that rage comes slowly over time. The Spear of Bastion is a bit better in single target. It has a slightly different crowd control effect with tethering. But yeah, I think this one also feels very good. So it's a pretty cool ability. It's a ton of fun. Kind of the archetype of what a Covenant ability should be, I think. So yeah, I think this one is good. And honestly, here's the thing, guys. With the other quick look guides, or not quick looks, but with the other class review series here, the Is It Any Good series, I've been able to sort of pick my favorite Covenant ability for every single class so far and say, you know what, I like this one best, and if I was to choose today, that's what I'd go for. With the warrior, to be honest, I'm actually not sure, and I'm not going to give you a recommendation because I think, well, like, why would I make it up just for the sake of it? With the other ones, there was a Covenant ability that stood out, and I said, I like this one. This one is my favorite for sure. Yeah, honestly, with the warrior, I could realistically, I'm gonna revisit it closer to Shadowlands. That's the honest truth. Closer to Shadowlands, after more tuning, I'll come back to it and then I'll make my decision. But I think I could actually enjoy any of them. To be completely honest, I quite like all of them. So there you are, which surprised me. Like I said, my initial thought was Venthyr all the way and all day. But I'm not so committed anymore. So that's my honest thoughts. The first spec to talk about then is the Arms Warrior, and this one really is, it's a mixed bag, guys. It really, really is a mixed bag. I was talking to the Warrior in my guild and getting his input, his insight, and from what he's saying, the Warrior community is very up in arms about the Arms spec. They're not all too happy, right? They're not all too happy. That being said, at the same time, when I played Arms, and I ran a few dungeons here on this with a couple of different talent builds, and what I found was that there was one talent build which I really didn't enjoy, which is actually sort of the recommended one right now. And the crux of this build was building around this new talent Cleave, or this new re-envisioning of Cleave, which I really don't like. And this version actually replaces Sweeping Strikes, right? And it gives you Cleave, which is the 6-second cooldown, strike enemies in front of you. It also consumes your overpower effects, which would normally be consumed by Mortal Strike. And I guess the idea is that this provides you with some consistent AoE damage. To be honest, I really, really didn't like it. And I also really didn't like how it replaced Sweeping Strikes. To me, Sweeping Strikes, where you cleave your attacks onto a second target, cleaving your Mortal Strikes, and most importantly, cleaving your executes, that to me is the core of what makes Arms fun. So to be honest, I really didn't enjoy playing with this build. It's also very, very undertuned as of the time of this recording, which I do expect should be tuned up by the time Shadowlands goes live. But that was, to me, very off-putting, and I didn't have a good time. Also, part of it was I was in a dungeon with 2 Frost Mages, which are incredibly overpowered. So it was a very bad time. Now, the good news is that I did go and I played a Warbreaker Ravager build, right? Where your Colossus Smash gets replaced in the talent tree with Warbreaker, which was your old Legion artifact ability, which essentially now makes Colossus Smash hit in AoE. And then Ravager... Ravager's really cool because now it follows your targets in Shadowlands. It will actually move after targets, so people won't get pulled out of its area of effect when you're kind of crying. And it also now has a 45-second cooldown, which syncs up perfectly with Colossus Smash. So the idea with this one is you do the throw down Ravager, It applies your mastery, because mastery now actually buffs the damage your ability does, instead of really being all focused on the bleed damage of your mastery. That's much weaker than it was in BFA. So you throw down your Ravager, then you smash them with this massive Warbreaker, and then you pop your sweeping strikes, and you start cleaving around with your mortal strikes and whatnot, and that feels very good. So that to me actually was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. I really did enjoy that. Still probably a little bit undertuned, but I think it's fun, and it captures the essence of what the warrior should be. And at the core of the spec, what really appeals to me about ARMS is that it is a slow spec, which is quite different from how it is at the end of BFA, with stacking loads of haste with expedient corruptions, right? Very, very, very different. But I like ARMS being a slow spec, where you have to wait for rage. You're not going to be pressing buttons on the global cooldown, right? You're going to have empty global cooldowns where you're waiting for spells, you're waiting for rage to build up, you're waiting for cooldowns. And I like that. I think that's fun. It's really weird to me to see warrior players come in and start complaining about how ARMS should be faster and should be pressing a button on every global cooldown. I even got one hilarious comment on my initial ARMS video, was going like, maybe they could generate rage like way faster, and then Mortal Strike could be, I don't know, kind of like Rampage for Fury Warrior, and let's just make it like Fury Warrior. And you're kind of sitting there going, well, but Fury Warrior exists. It's in the same class. A Fury Warrior gives you that spec, which is all about pressing buttons on the global cooldown, and it's very fast and very spammy. And I really like actually the dichotomy between the two, where ARMS is slow and more methodical, and it has its ups and its downs, and I enjoy that, and I think it's cool. And that is something that ARMS, in my opinion, still does well. It still does well. But yeah, I think there are major problems with the cleave talent, for sure. That stands out as being weird. Another good news is that you've got Spell Reflect baseline and Die by the Sword. The cooldowns have gone down, so your defensives are a lot better now as ARMS, which is good. That definitely feels a bit more appealing. But yeah, like Whirlwind really doesn't do much damage. The ARMS warriors are saying Mortal Strike feels a bit weak. So I think there's still, at the time of this recording, a lot of tuning concerns with the ARMS warrior. I think if they do get tuned up, I think they're going to feel a lot better. I think once their Covenant abilities get tuned a bit more, they're going to feel a lot better. And I'm hoping that they will be a strong spec, because in my opinion, they are a very fun spec, which is about playing around your cooldowns, having big burst damage, big 2-target cleaving damage with sweeping strikes. I think that is core. Yeah, hopefully there's time for Blizzard to rework Cleave. I've seen suggestions that either it shares a cooldown with Mortal Strike, which I'd be fine with, or more interesting, that it could just be a baseline ability, or keep it as a talent, but have it just increase the damage of your Whirlwind per target hit. That would be more fun as well, which is, I think, the Legion design. I think that's something that ARMS Warriors want in general, is a bit of a return to some of the Legion designs. But yeah, I'm going to leave it at that, guys. In my opinion, it's actually quite a fun spec, though burdened by some tuning issues and a couple of kind of questionable talents that I'm not sure particularly fit. So there you go. That's the ARMS Warrior. Let's talk about Fury Warrior then. How is Fury looking in Shadowlands? Well, to be honest with you, Fury is looking almost exactly the same as it was in BFA. There's some slight tuning changes, like, for example, your self-healing from Bloodthirst has gone down. The haste that you're going to be getting while you're enraged has also gone down a little bit. But for the most part, really, it plays mostly the same, right? It mostly plays the same. They're minor changes, but they're not going to really... not going to break the game. You're not going to feel all that different. One of the biggest changes, most noticeable ones, of course, is that Single-Minded Fury is back, which is going to let you fight dual-wielding one-handed weapons. Alternatively to, of course, Titan's Grip, where you can fight dual-wielding two-handed weapons. Apologies if you can hear some explosions in the background. Someone's setting off fireworks. I guess they're getting ready for Halloween. But yeah, I think that's fine. My opinion, actually, I agree with a lot of the comments that people left on my initial Fury video, which was that, well, they'd rather it be just a transmog option, to be honest, just a transmog thing, because they're just a bit worried about some of the loot drama and just some of the hassle of having to collect, two-handed weapons for ARMS, then your one-handers for Fury, if that's the build you're going for, and blah, blah, blah. So, I don't know. I think it's probably good to have options overall, especially with the weapon token system that is in Castle Natria, but it is just something to be aware about. And I also have to say that, to be honest with you guys, I was pretty harsh on Fury in my first video. I described the spec as relatively boring, but I gotta be honest, it has grown on me, right? The spec has grown on me. The more I've played it on the beta, it actually has, for two main reasons. Number one, which is something that surprised me, but removing recklessness from the GCD, recklessness being, of course, your major cooldown as Fury Warrior, actually really improved the gameplay of the spec, in my opinion. This really surprised me because, you know, like people go on massive rants about the GCD and BFA and those changes, how every spec in the game was ruined. And of course, you know, for me in BFA, I mostly played Shadow Priest, and then I also played Havoc Demon Hunter in 8.3, neither spec of which, of course, was basically affected at all by the GCD changes, like really almost not at all. So it's quite funny to sit there and have people tell you how the game was ruined for everyone, and you're going, well, didn't affect my 2 specs really. So, you know, make your feedback accurate, please. I beg you. But yeah, honestly, the GCD change, removing recklessness for Fury Warriors, actually makes a massive difference. I think the reason is that Fury is such a fast-paced spec. It's so spammy that having just an empty GCD activating recklessness felt very, very bad. The bad news is that recklessness no longer generates rage baseline, but there is a new and quite fun talent actually called Reckless Abandon at level 50, which makes recklessness generate 50 rage, and it also empowers your Bloodthirst and your Raging Blow to essentially become slightly better versions of their abilities. So it's quite fun rotationally, I have to say. It's a little bit cluttered, but it's quite fun. But that gives you the rage generation back, and that does feel really good. But yeah, it keeps up the pace of the spec, and it just plays into that very, very, very fast and furious gameplay that you've got going on, which feels good to me. So I like that a lot. The other thing that I really appreciate with Fury is Whirlwind and how Whirlwind enables your AoE. So essentially when you do a Whirlwind and you hit targets, right, it makes your next 2 single target attacks strike up to 4 additional targets for 50% damage. You know, simple but very effective. And from having played every single spec across beta, obviously marksmanship hunters have a very similar effect with their trick shots, where their multi-shot will let their aim shot or their rapid fire cleave to multiple targets. And Outlaw Rogue, of course, famously have Blade Flurry, where they press Blade Flurry, and that makes their single target attacks cleave to additional targets. Fury's one is by far the most fun. This has by far the best gameplay, right? Maintaining that Whirlwind buff, you know, you have to make actual decisions. It feels impactful, and it just feels right in your rotation. It feels wonderful to play in AoE, and you really feel like you're just smacking dudes for a whole lot of damage. Although their tuning is relatively low right now. I think they literally just got buffed this week because their tuning was a bit low. But it feels good, right? That's the most important thing, because tuning is going to happen. It's the feel, though, is probably relatively stuck where it is for Shadowlands. But it feels good, and that's a lot of fun managing that. I do feel like this falls off in single target for Fury. They're a lot more boring in single target, where in single target, essentially, Whirlwind becomes just pure filler, which you do press. So you just do these random Whirlwinds just because you've nothing better to press. So that's not as good. But in AoE, they definitely have this great flow to the spec. You know, you've got fun talents like Dragon's Roar, you know, Recklessness having a nice short cooldown. It's good. It's really good. It's a fun AoE spec that's just always blasting, and I appreciate that. I mean, again, the only perhaps downside is what I already said in my Fury spec highlight video, which is that it is a spec that is basically always blasting. There's not too many highs. There's not too many lows. It's quite a steady spec. And for some people, that's going to be very appealing. For other people, it's not. What I will say is I do think it's a good companion spec to ARMS, where ARMS is a spec with high highs and low lows. That is very much about cooldowns and playing around those cooldowns, playing around execute window. With Fury, it's that much more consistent damage. It's always blasting. I think the 2 specs go very well together, and I think that is something that definitely goes very much in the favor of the class, right? That you have these 2 different and divergent DPS playstyles that you can go for. Though, of course, when it comes to a competitive level, typically it's whichever one is the best one that you're going to be mostly playing. But at least you have the option, you know, when you're playing for fun, which I do recommend most people do most of the time. Play for fun. That's what the game is here for. Yeah, you can, you know, bring out those different specs in Mythic Plus and have very different experiences, and I think that's good. Finally, we're going to talk about Protection Warrior. And the initial reaction for most people when they looked at Protection Warrior in Shadowlands, myself included, was one of despair. Because Protection Warriors are the gods of 8.3 right now in terms of certainly Mythic Plus tanking. They just do massively more damage than the other tanks can do. They're incredibly survivable. They've got ridiculously short cooldowns, incredible talent synergies, and coming into Shadowlands, Blizzard has nerfed that into the ground, right? They've split up those talents. They've rearranged your talent tree to really split up those overpowered talent builds that were there before. They nerfed the AoE damage, and yeah, you're just losing all of those sort of borrowed powers from BFA that really enabled you to be, let's be real here, kind of broken. And the good news is that since the start of the beta, they have been buffing up Protection Warrior. Since those initial changes, they've very much upped their AoE damage, which is good. They've upped their baseline armor, which is also really good. So they're now, I think right now, they're actually quite a solid tank. They are a solid tank that can easily compete with the other tanks. And I think that's a good thing to hear. I think it's still going to be a shock for you if you played Warrior at the end of BFA. It's going to be a shock. And listen, here's the best way I can put it is, if you want your spec to be just objectively better than all the other specs and you want to be overpowered, like you were in BFA, you are going to be disappointed in Shadowlands. But if you're happy being just, a good spec that is a genuine competitor, not overpowered, but genuinely competes with the other tank specs in a tanking scenario, which at the moment is actually quite well balanced, then I think you can really start to enjoy this spec. The strengths and weaknesses of Protection are pretty much the same that they've always been. They've got good damage mitigation. You've got lots of defensive cooldowns. Those defensive cooldowns feel good to play with, I would say. You've got, you're fairly good at dealing with mobs when they are stacked up on top of you. You're good at tanking those mobs. You're a straightforward tank. Where they do fall down a bit, certainly, is their general utility. I think it's a bit low, and certainly when mobs are spread apart and split apart, you really don't have a whole lot of tools to deal with that. Compared to, let's say, the Brewmaster Monk, with their Rings of Peace and their ability to kite, with Keg Smash from range and that sort of stuff. That's quite interesting for Brewmaster and their mobility. Or if you compare, let's say, the Vengeance Demon Hunter and the stuff they can do with their, their Sigils of Chains and Sigils of Silence and Misery, like those AoE Fear sigils, the Chaining Sigils, leaping around. There's sort of interesting stuff that those specs kind of bring in terms of that broader utility that Protection doesn't quite have. They don't quite have that for sure. But the good news is that they are still, in my opinion, from having played them, a solid tank. I think they're still fun. I think they are still good. They're still good. With the buffs that they've gotten over the course of the beta, I think they are in a decent spot. The talent tree, I will say, might be a little bit boring after the rework. That might be certainly something that you could point to, and I wouldn't say you were wrong. But certainly, I think Protection Warriors are coming into Shadowlands with an awful lot of fear from that initial reaction to the beta, and just my main goal here is to reassure you that it's no longer as bad as that initially seemed. It's still a big fall from grace, but it's a fall into what's looking to be quite a balanced place, not a fall into total obscurity and irrelevance. So yeah, there we go. So there you have it, guys. There are all the Warrior specs. And as you can tell, it's kind of, my opinions on most of these have really changed, right? They've really changed. So my initial look at the Warrior was that I found Fury kind of boring, and Protection just seemed terrible, whereas I really, really liked Arms. I've kind of switched my opinions on all of them, where I actually now quite enjoy Fury and quite enjoy Protection, actually. And I think they're both solid specs, solid specs with strengths and weaknesses. And for me, those weaknesses they're a bit off-putting. They're not my cup of tea, but I could easily see how those strengths and weaknesses could be someone's cup of tea and could be a very, very legitimate choice. For Arms, I think Arms is still in a little bit more of a question mark, a little bit more of a precarious situation right now. So that is certainly something to be aware of. I don't agree with some of the directions they've taken with Arms, in particular with, Cleave. Cleave really stands out. But I do think that there is a very fun playstyle there for Arms, which is built around that, 45-second cooldowns of Ravager and Warbreaker, and Sweeping Strikes. Those abilities are very fun to me. They're very fun. But yeah, it does seem like there are some tuning issues and a couple of little design issues there for Arms. But with, a little bit of time left on the beta, we still don't know the launch date of the game. I think there is still time for Blizzard to make changes. They don't seem like massive changes to me to make these specs very good. So the Warrior class right now, certainly at time of recording, a little bit undertuned for the DPS specs. The Protection is looking solid enough, I think. But yeah, I expect that it should be, I think, a solid enough class coming into Shadowlands. Not my personal favorite, but at this point, that's becoming much more of a personal thing. I think it's much more of a personal thing. And I think most people could pick this class up and have a very, very good time. So guys, thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.